So my name is Edward Foley. I am a Capuchin priest. I taught here at Catholic Theological Union for 36 years, and I'm now the Duns Scotus Professor Emeritus of Spirituality and retired Professor of Worship and Music. And I'm directing this grant in Neuroscience and Preaching, as well as another grant on Preaching with the Sciences. So this project actually flowed out of a previous one. The previous one, we looked at how does one use the sciences in preaching, because most preachers weren't using it at all in the Roman Catholic Church. And then that got me thinking about what's the science behind the preaching. And there is very little, if any, empirical data about what makes effective preaching. We have anecdotal information. Some people, for example, they'll have a website, and if they've gotten 20,000 hits on their homily, that's data, but we don't know what makes it effective. So the goal here is, this is a kind of case study to put religion in dialogue with the empirical sciences, especially around the issue here of preaching, but I think it'll have much wider implications. Well, I think understanding the cognitive psychology and also the neuroscience of it is going to be really important, because since we only have anecdotal information about what makes preaching effective, and therefore when people are taught how to preach, they're often taught somewhat anecdotally from the teacher's own perspective. But if we have some data, and there are some hunches because there are some data around things like narrativity, and metaphoricity, using metaphors, that makes it more effective. But what we'd like to do is, that's simply anecdotal, and if we could say with some empirical clarity, yes, using metaphorical language, the variation in tone quality, gestures, storytelling, if we can demonstrate empirically that does contribute to effective preaching, then I think we will better equip both the preacher to say, hey, well, I never thought about using metaphorical language, and it'll also helpfully equip teachers of preaching that they can cue their students to say, these are proven effective elements of creating compelling preaching. Well, when you think about the conflict between religion and especially Christianity, what comes to mind is the Galileo event and the Galileo effect, where the church condemned him because of his interpretation of Scripture, actually saying that the earth was not the center of the universe. And it took the Vatican just 300 years to admit that he was right. But there are many ways that throughout the Renaissance, for example, that when you think about the painting of Michelangelo or the work of Da Vinci, they were doing anatomical studies, they were doing dissections, they were doing science. And that certainly contributed to the arts, especially Da Vinci's work in dissection. And then when you think about the work by a number of very famous clerics on thinking about medicine and eventually about physics, and then the Enlightenment period engaging that. So there's been a kind of off again, on again, when the sciences contribute to the church's agenda, it appears to be much more acceptable. But I think one of the things that happened, especially in Roman Catholicism, is that in the Second Vatican Council between 1962 and 1965, there was a statement about the church living in the modern world. And in that text, it says not only that the church contributes to the world, but the world contributes to the church. And so the sciences and the political sciences, and even in keeping the church honest about things like vaccines and COVID, and that it makes a great contribution. And the current Pope himself, his first degree was in chemistry. And he has written that the sciences are incredibly important, that we have to engage with them. He had a very famous encyclical, Laudato Si, on the home environment and the world. And he's saying that it's the empirical sciences that are help us understanding that we're damaging the earth, and we have to acquire these insights and skills to enable a more effective and healthier environment for the global community. Well, I think the homiletic event is actually, in theological terms, what we call an act of practical theology. But practical theology has a very close relationship with practical wisdom. And so that there is a focus on not simply getting the theory, but doing the practice. The body imbibes wisdom in many respects by doing effective practices and learning from those practices. So that I think, number one, training young preachers to enter this as not simply a kind of robotic thing they have to do or a technology they have to enact, but it's an embodied kind of technology that really is a journey into wisdom. So it seems to me the more effective somebody is nourished in being a preacher, it is interconnected with their own wisdom as a pastoral leader. I mean, I actually think of this project as a case study in how we wed what the sciences teach us about wisdom with active ministry, which is supposed to be embedded in and a journey into wisdom. And so I think it's important both for the preacher, if they pursue this with seriousness and direction, but then it's also, in many respects, an invitation into the wisdom of the church and the wisdom of the tradition, and some would even say the wisdom of God, to a community. And so if we're preaching wisely, if we're preaching human dignity, if we're preaching about those fundamental moral values that are at the heart of this study, then we're not only teaching people or inviting people into full Christianity, we're inviting them into humanity. Well, at the end of the project, I want to be able to say with some clarity, in collaboration with Howard Nussbaum and the Apex team, that we have created a kind of synergy between science and pastoral ministry, and we're just beginning. So there is no way that in this 4-year grant that is quite limited to Roman Catholic preaching in Sunday assemblies by ordained clergy, we're not going to learn everything we need to know. But if we can move credibly forward enough to say that the wedding of neuroscience and cognitive psychology and pastoral ministry is moving the bar line, is moving the goalposts so that we can become increasingly effective, I think that then positions us to not only for teachers of preaching and for preachers to say, okay, let's respond to the sciences. They got a lot to teach us. They're imaginative. They test ideas. They're always looking for truth. But it also positions us to say, this is a project, and not simply this grant, but this is a project between religion and science that's got to keep moving forward. Otherwise, religion's credibility and the Roman Catholic Church's credibility, which has taken deep hits in the last couple of decades, is going to continue to decline. And even, it's not about like getting more adherents into the church. Pope Francis talks about people who belong to no religion as precious allies in upholding human dignity. And so hopefully this kind of case study will enable us to be more effective dialogue partners because we're respecting, the social sciences and cognitive psychology and neuroscience, to say, we understand some of this the way you do. We can speak your language, at least as a second language, and learn to develop proper collaboration so that we can move forward on upholding human dignity and justice and encouraging moral virtue. I did a little study a while back that was somewhat unrelated to this, but it gave me some insight about saying what makes an effective preacher or what makes an effective minister. And the one thing that kept coming back over and over and over again is that they have to be open and they have to be imaginative. And so one of my hopes is that that people have open minds about this. I actually was presenting this to a quite distinguished colleague who said, I would be loath to have anything from the social sciences tell me how I should do my preaching. And I thought to myself, that's not the openness that we need in the 21st century if we're going to move forward. So the number one hope is that people are open. They don't have to accept everything that we find or all the proposals we make, but hopefully they will be open enough to say and imaginative enough to say, I can think this way, I can change, I can maybe even get better, I can keep more people awake when I'm preaching, which is a wonderful thing. One of the things that I do, and I understand that there is some basis for this in psychology, I borrow the method of a very famous preacher who says, don't let people know where you're going. And so I try not to have a linear, I do not tell them where I'm going. He said it's sort of like Shakespeare walking out onto the apron of the stage and say, this is a terrible tragedy, and this couple, they fall in love and they end up committing suicide. Who's going to stay for the show? And so part of it is keeping them with you. And the other thing, and this is part of the very important, I think, from the viewpoint of practical wisdom, is that the nice thing, or I think a great thing about Roman Catholic belief is that Jesus was fully human and fully divine, and people came to know his divinity through his humanity. So I think preaching to people's humanity at the beginning and not starting with church teaching or something like that, even those who don't believe, who are disaffiliating, they can still move along. Like this coming Sunday, I'm preaching about telling the truth, because that's what the gospel is about. Well, I spent the week studying all of these psychological studies about how many people lie, and that they do it. The one study says that in an average 10-minute conversation with a complete stranger, we lie at least 2 or 3 times. And so using that kind of, and then of course you say, so how many times am I going to lie to you as a preacher in this coming 10 minutes? But starting at the human level that people can engage with, and I want to engage not just somebody from my cohort, not just the baby boomers, but young people think digitally, they think scientifically, and I think it's a way also to engage emerging adults and adolescents who many of them think scientifically. Well, one of the things that's astounded me in the first year, and this is why I'm really so thrilled and impressed with working with Apex Lab, is they were farther along in the first months of this than I ever imagined. And when I've been talking to other program directors who also have similar grants, I mean, they are in nowhere near the progression that we've made in terms of the experiments, in terms of trying to do this reviewers in English and Spanish, having a great assessment team, having Michael Spezio with us and lead this. I mean, I feel that we're so far ahead. And at the last assessment meeting we had, when these young, bright people were giving us, information, were giving us reports on the pupillary dilation studies and the large language model coding that was going on, and even if they could see that if they could get a chatbot trained to be able to do this, and looking at the 500 responses we've already gotten ready from people, and having the way that Gabe was sort of analyzing that in multiple ways, I think we're much farther ahead than I thought we were going to be at this stage. And it only excites me in sort of the brave new world that's ahead. And if we're doing this already in the 11th month of the first year. What are we going to be like at the end of year 4? I can't wait.
That was beautiful. Thank you. Is there anything else you think we should include? I mean, we'll catch up with you in a year, but anything else that you want to include?
Some of this harkens back to a previous grant that we had, and the goal of that grant was to take 5 world-class scientists and put them together with 10 young, intelligent, imaginative homilists. And out of that, we have a website for this, and we've generated about 140 homily outlines. They're not full texts because people have got to do their own work, but saying, okay, on this Sunday with these readings, these are 3 possible scientific avenues you could explore, and here are resources, and everything is hyperlinked, and then saying, here's taking one of them and showing how it could be developed as a homily that relies on scientific research, like my coming homily on the truth is going to be using a series of studies that talk about how people lie, how truth is dangerous. There's actually a truth-telling laboratory up at the University of British Columbia that's got great stuff. And these are short videos. Some of them are like 3 or 4 minutes long, and you could learn some of this basic information like within 3 or 4 minutes, that lying is bad for your health, actually. And truth-telling actually contributes to both physical and mental well-being. And preachers are always looking for ideas. And scientists are so imaginative. It's one of the reasons we started that project, and all of it's free online, Preaching with the Sciences, which is connecting with this one. As part of the October meeting, the team from Apex and Howard Nussbaum and our head of assessment, Michael Spezio, came over, and they spent a morning with some of our teaching faculty, those who teach preaching, and some of the leadership of Catholic Theological Union to keep them abreast of this. And I think one of the important connections there is that this is very, very exciting for Catholic Theological Union. Not only have we not done anything like this before, nobody's done anything like this before. So I think keeping our leadership attuned to what's happening allows us to publicize this. It certainly looks good for CTU, but also collaborating with the University of Chicago is a great boon for us as well. So whenever we meet these biannual assessment meetings, we have a morning assessment meeting with the leadership of Catholic Theological Union, and then some of them come with us as we go in the afternoon over to Apex and get the reports and the insights about the more scientific projects and experiments that are underway. I do read a lot of data, especially from the Pew Forum, but their data is presented in a way that a layperson can understand. And I think that's going to be important for us because we're going to be communicating to people who don't have a scientific background. And I think doing this in the kind of graphs or the kind of visuals that we use will contribute to getting this out to a general public. And I think that's something we have to start thinking from the beginning, and that's why having people like Richard Fragamini and Annie McGowan and our graduate assistant and our public relations director at the afternoon meetings is really important for their insight. So a homily in the Roman Catholic Church is technically defined as a preaching that occurs within a sacrament, especially at Mass. And it's a required element. It's only allowed to be given by an ordained person, so a deacon, a priest, or a bishop. Its requirement, its responsibility is to engage with the sacred text, which includes the readings, but also the text of the Mass, and to break them open in such a way that it invites people into a dialogue with God. So I define a homily as a ritual dialogue between God and people, and the preacher is the one who lights the match. The preacher is the one who engages the two, but the preacher is not the subject of the preaching, and the assembly is not the object. God and the assembly are the subjects. They are the ones in the dialogue. And the homilist is the facilitator to allow the encounter, a life-changing encounter, to occur. A fundamental goal here is to provide empirically based data that will be helpful to homilists. So they don't necessarily need to understand all the scientific studies, but that we will have empirically based, not just people's instincts or not just people's hunches, but that we will actually ground the direction in credible data so that they have solid footing for moving forward, for improving their homilies. So it's trying to use the sciences as a credible grounding, just like it has to be theologically grounded, it also has to be grounded in the human sciences because we're preaching to human beings. And hopefully the scientific grounding will allow preachers to be more credible, more effective, more engaging, and to light the match so that the encounter between God and people is more effective. But I think the biggest caution at this point is precisely people's stereotypic understanding of science. And sometimes they believe what science does is take the mystery out of it and tries to take the mystery out of religion. But scientists are some of the most imaginative people in the world. I mean, when you look at the work of somebody like Einstein, all of his theories were basically proven by thought experiments. There was no empirical experiment at the time when those famous 4 papers came out in 1904 that could prove his theories. And he did them all through thought experiments. And in many respects, that's analogous to what theologians and what preachers are doing. We're doing a thought experiment with people about God and about salvation and about virtue. And so trying to get people to break down some of their presuppositions, epistemic humility, even about what science can contribute, I think is probably going to be one of the biggest obstacles. And that's why we need to be able to communicate this material in an affirming, credible, and accessible way to ordinary preachers.